Good evening, everyone, and happy National Tree Week. It's the nation's largest festival of trees, which marks the start of the winter planting season. Thank you so much for joining us, and I can say from all around the world, to celebrate trees and mistletoe this evening. My name is Sara, and I'm CEO of the Tree Council, which is a national charity that brings everyone together for the love of trees. And tonight, we're delighted to welcome Chris Thorogood and Roberto Salguero-Gomez, both of whom are distinguished experts in their field from Oxford University. Chris regularly appears on Gardener's Question Time and is a talented artist as well as an academic. And Rob works with the head gardeners at 37 Oxford colleges, no less. And they're going to tell us a little bit about themselves later, so I won't go into more detail now, except to say that they've devised a thrilling and extraordinary evening for you, focused on that sneaky creature, mistletoe. Tonight is especially timely because, as well as being National Tree Week, we've also this week marked National Mistletoe Day, which was on the 1st of December, earlier this week. This special day was recognised in Parliament in 2005 by a motion put forward by the Tenbury English Mistletoe Enterprise. So just whilst the last people are arriving, the conversation is going to begin in just a moment, but first, a brief item of housekeeping. If you have any questions that you would like to ask Chris or Rob, do please put them in the Q&A. Put them there rather than the chat, and we'll endeavour to answer as many as possible at the end. Put them in as you think of them going through. Thank you, Chris and Rob, for your fantastic support, and thank you to you, our audience, for joining us on a Friday evening. And now it's time to settle back comfortably. I'm going to hand you over to our experts to thrill us with vampire tales from the world of plants. Over to you, Chris and Rob.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah. I'm just going to wait for Rob to, so deftly done, to share to share our slides. And we're both absolutely delighted to join you, Sarah, you and your team, and the audience this evening to talk about mistletoe and other vampires. I perhaps should put that the other way around, because I think we're going to talk about the other vampires, and then we'll move on to mistletoe. So we'll put that into some context for you. But yeah, we're delighted to join you. And I think on the next slide, Rob, we'll introduce ourselves. And so I'll let you introduce yourself, Rob, and then I'll say a few words about myself.
Sounds good. So first of all, let me thank the Tree Council, and especially Sara, for the opportunity to share with you some of the research that Chris and I have been conducting at the University of Oxford for the last few years. My name is Rob Salguero-Gomez. I am originally from Spain, and I am an associate professor in ecology at the Department of Biology, Oxford.
Thanks, Rob. And I suppose for my introduction, I'm not going to give a formal one, and I'm just going to say that I was the sort of kid that was fascinated by living things, and you know, the sort of nature nut that has rears butterflies on their windowsill and keeps pet toads in the garden, and I loved science, and I always used to look at a living thing and I'd think, how does this work, and why is this living thing the way it is? And I feel in some way I was sort of destined to become a botanist and an evolutionary biologist, and so there will be a sort of theme, I think, of evolutionary biology running through this talk, and us examining the plants that we're looking at and understanding why are they the way they are. And so, yeah, so I grew up to be the botanist. Thanks, Rob. I grew up to be the botanist I wanted to be, and so I have spent a significant part of my life trekking, wading through swamps, trekking up mountains, going into rainforests, and having pretty much a whale of a time. And I do hope I can persuade you that being a botanist is well, I think it's the best job in the world. Thanks, Rob. And on the next slide, I'll just briefly touch upon what we'd like to talk about today. So I'll start with an introduction to the establishment where I work, Oxford Botanic Garden, which is actually in the background of this photograph, or some of it is. And then I mentioned the vampires. Forgive me for the use of that word, but it will become clear why I have and how that's relevant to mistletoe in particular. because mistletoe, as you probably know, is a form of parasitic plant. And then friend or foe. So Rob and I are both going to sort of deal with this question in different ways. Because parasite comes with all sorts of connotations, generally negative, and so we're going to discuss some of the positives about that. Then I'm going to share some of the mistletoes from around the world, because it's not just the one that we're familiar with. And then I'm going to hand over to Rob, who's going to take us through some of the research that he does. And more latterly, we've joined forces and worked together. He's going to describe what he calls the parasite conundrum, and then future prospects. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions. And I've already seen one come through about how to grow mistletoe, which is actually very straightforward. So we're very happy to answer some of those questions after our talk as well. So without further ado, so this is a colourful slide, I suppose. So I said I introduced myself, and I talked about how I'm a botanist and what I love. And I work at Oxford Botanic Garden, the University of Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum. And the Botanic Garden this year, it's a very special year for us, 2021, because it's our 400th anniversary. We are, in fact, the oldest botanic garden in the UK. We're one of the oldest in the world. We're not the oldest, but we have a very rich history at Oxford Botanic Garden, and have 4 centuries of having grown, conserved and researched plants. I'm particularly interested in some of the plants that I've collated on the screen here in front of you that are not necessarily what you might think of as conventional plants, and I'll explain what I mean. I think there's a tendency when we think about plants, perhaps mistletoes aside, as being passive or there for our enjoyment, a form of greenery or a beautiful backdrop against which, for animals and including humans, against which to exist. And to me, that is slightly problematic, actually, because I think there is a risk that we can actually elevate the importance of animals above plants. And actually, we share the biosphere, that thin layer of life on our planet that we call home, with hundreds of thousands of different types of plant that we depend on for our very survival and our existence. And were there for a long time before we even existed. And so not only do we have a duty of care to protect them and appreciate and foster a care and wonder for plants, I believe, but I think for their own sake as well, I think we need to value the importance of plants and trees, and that includes mistletoes, which we'll come on to. Now, each of the plants on this slide sort of challenge that notion in different ways of plants being just sort of yes, thank you for that comment, that without plants, animals wouldn't survive. That's absolutely true. And these plants on this screen, I've selected them because they I think in some way challenge that notion of plants as being just a pretty backdrop and nice greenery. These are plants that have evolved myriad different ways of surviving that include the sap-sucking pilferers, the vampires, of which we're going to look more closely. They are plants that imprison insects and enslave them to their pollination services without offering them any reward. And there are killers, so the ones on the right, the carnivorous plants that have evolved all sorts of an arsenal, if you like, of tricks, traps and snares to attract, entice and kill animal prey to nourish themselves. So there we are. We have a whole portfolio of plants, a few of which we're going to focus on in more detail in this talk, that don't just sort of sit there and I think we think of plants as existing on a different time scale as well, and actually you only have to see plants sped up in through time-lapse photography to appreciate them on a level that's perhaps more that's easier to understand. So we're going to be talking about a specific form of these plants tonight, and I'm going to start by talking about these vampire plants, as I call them, the parasitic plants more broadly, of which mistletoe is one, and then we're going to zoom into mistletoe specifically. And and thanks, Rob. And a bit before I do so, I need to introduce the group of plants that we're dealing with, these vampires that I've called them. Why have I called them vampires? And I remember once someone made a comment to me that they really didn't like the fact that I called them this. They thought it was trivial, frivolous, and sort of dumbing it down. That's not my intention at all. Actually, the reason I use vampires is that they suck the sap from other plants. So there is quite a clear metaphor to me. And also the reason I like being playful with the language as well is that scientists run the risk of talking to themselves and using fancy and complicated words that sometimes describe quite simple concepts, and I don't think that necessarily does much for the debate in terms of bringing people in to the discourse. And so I'm quite fond of using different words to describe what we're talking about. But whether you call them vampires or parasitic plants, let's have a deeper dive into what those are. And on the left is the one that we're going to focus on, which is mistletoe, and on the right is something altogether quite different, which is a real beast of a plant. You can broadly, and there are different ways to do it, there are broadly different ways that we can classify these plants, and one is into what we call hemiparasites. These are the plants that are photosynthetic, and you can see that mistletoe is green. It has leaves, they function, and so in that way it can nourish itself just as we all know plants do when they photosynthesize. However, it is parasitic because, as we also know, and there's one actually in the screen behind me, if you can see that, on a beautiful mountainside in Greece, they live perched in the treetops where they pilfer or extract their food from their host, in this case various trees. Meanwhile, there are another group of plants called the holoparasites, and we have examples that grow here in the UK, all around the world. So the examples that we're familiar with are Orobanche, which I'll show in a few moments. And this one happens to be the largest flower in the world, called Rafflesia. And do you know, I think I wasn't sure if I was going to do this or not, but I think I'm going to give it a try. I want to show you a replica life size to show you just how big it grows. So welcome to the office of a botanist. Hopefully, if my screen permits, if I move it enough, you can get an idea. Rob, help me out. Was that good enough? Did you get a glimpse of?
I think we were able to get an idea of just about how big it is. Yeah,
that's the largest. So that's the largest flower in the world, folks. So that grows to well over a metre across, and it grows in Southeast Asia. And it's a plant that I've always been fascinated with, and I work on. They all belong to the vampires, the parasitic plants. Next slide, please, Rob. And what a motley bunch they are. So here is just an assortment that I've collated just to give you an idea of the sort of monsters we're talking about. The ones on the left are a group that grow from Japan west to tropical Africa, that have curious blue flowers in life. In the middle are some Australian orchids, Rhizanthella, and on the right are some plants called Hydnora from Africa. Aren't they a menacing looking bunch? Next slide, please, Rob. Thank you. And I'd like to examine a particular group of these parasitic plants that have taken parasitism to a whole different level. These ones that you can see on the screen, including the giant Rafflesia that I just showed you, are what we call endoparasites. So not only do they pilfer or steal their existence at the expense of other plants, they don't manufacture their own food via photosynthesis, they have no leaves, no roots, and never will have. They actually live inside the tissues of their host plants. So they are no longer free living in any way at all. In fact, the only time they even emerge outside of the body of their host is when they flower and fruit and set seed. So they spend the vast majority of their life cycle actually within another plant. So this is a plant that lives in a plant, which is simply extraordinary. And on the left there, you probably can't see all the detail on the slide, and don't really need to, but this is what we call the angiosperm phylogeny. So what that means is the flowering plant family tree. So here are all the main groups of flowering plants. Every flowering plant you can think of sits somewhere there. And I've highlighted in red 4 of the branches, if you like, and indicated each one with a little image. These are the 4 times that this kind of parasite that lives inside other plants has evolved. So 4 times. Do you know, Leslie has just commented that these are similar to mushrooms, and it's like you've read my mind, Leslie, because wait wait till you see the next slide. So these extraordinary plants, they live inside other plants. And what I find really fascinating about this, and working with other scientists around the world, there's a scientist called Charles Davis, a colleague of mine in Harvard, who with his team have examined how the genes, the DNA, the genetic material of the host plants can end up in the parasites, which is extraordinary. So when we think of inheritance, that's the vertical transmission of genes from parent to child, obviously. But there are some rare cases in which genes can actually move laterally or horizontally from one organism, a non-mating organism, to another. The question, are they more akin to animals than plants? I'll come on to that. So genes that can move from one organism to another, and so there's a lot of genetic content, DNA, in these parasitic plants that they actually got from their hosts by living inside their host plants. And we don't understand the ins and outs, all the ins and outs of it, but it's very, very fascinating and ripe for further research. Next slide, please, Rob. And I'm so glad that we had a flurry of questions about comparing these plants to fungi, because you're absolutely right. They are very similar in some respects to fungi. They are not fungi, and they're not a bit related to fungi at all. So fungi belong to a different kingdom altogether. But that makes this even more striking, because this is an example of what evolutionary biologists call convergence. And so a basic example of convergent evolution would be that you've got cacti in the Americas, and then you've got plants that look exactly like cacti in Africa, but they're not cacti. They look the same, but they're actually unrelated, but they evolved under the same selective pressures to their environment, i.e. drought. In this case, both the parasitic plant, the one that we're looking at the top and the 4 circles below, and the fungus, the biotrophic fungus at the bottom, they both evolved strategies to infect and steal food from their hosts, and therefore they show similarities in life cycle, even though they're completely unrelated because they belong to different kingdoms. And yet the parallels are clear from both the macroscopic, the visual, that as some of the audience have seen, right the way down to the physiological and even the molecular mechanisms that they use. And I can see some people have already answered the question about lichens, so thanks thanks for that. But if we just go from left to right very briefly, because I don't want this to be too much of a textbook like slide, but you've got tiny seeds of a parasite and spores of a fungus. They respond to chemical stimulants produced by a specific host. And in the case of the parasite at the top, they then latch on, and I'll show you an example of this in a mistletoe in a moment. And then they live, in this case, embedded inside the tissues of their host. So that string of cells is the parasite living inside its host, and then it erupts through the surface with these giant football-like buds that burst into these huge flowers, and then they set seed. But the reality is, very little is understood about the biology of these plants. They are really sort of botanical enigmas of the plant kingdom. Next slide, please, Rob. And one of the defining features of these parasitic plants that I've described a few of so far is that they have a means of plugging into their host, and they do so with an organ called a haustorium, which incidentally is also something that fungi use as well. So there's another parallel. And so what we're looking at here, and I think Rob's actually going to show us later on a physical example of this. This is a photo that we took of some material from here at the Botanic Garden where I'm sitting at the moment. And you can see on the right is the tree branch, and I can't honestly remember. I think it was a Davidia it was a limb that we pruned, and on the left is the mistletoe that you can see growing, sprouting directly out of the tree branch, and it almost seems to be growing as one, doesn't it? It looks like one sort of naturally sprouted out of the other rather than necessarily a parasite, and that's how intimate these associations are, which can give you clues as to how they've exchanged genes over the course of evolutionary time. And through the course of this through this physiological bridge, if you like, the haustorium, this acts as a sort of vascular connection. So if you're aware of things like xylem and phloem, so the conducting tissues that plants use to pump things around the body, if you like, of the plant, akin, if you like, to our veins and arteries, it attaches to those vascular tissues of the host plant, and so you have a vascular continuum between the water conducting plumbing of the host plant and then the plumbing of the parasite, and so it siphons it off. And in many cases, though not all, the host doesn't know, if you like, that's going on. So it sort of there's no resistance response, and the parasite just grows and grows unchecked. It's like it's silently stealing electricity from the grid, and growing and growing at the expense of the host plant, which is which can be quite detrimental, as we'll discover in a second. And on the next slide, you can see that if you were to cut one of these open and you were to look at a cellular level, those structures in the cells in blue that look like teeth, those are in this case what we call sinkers, which are analogous to roots, but they are what penetrate the vascular tissue, which is at the bottom of this diagram, and then they suck out the water and the solutes to nourish the parasite. And so there, I think you get a good example of the plant behaving like a vampire. And I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about some of the, before we come on to the mistletoes. On the next slide, Rob, please. I want to explore this question of friend or foe, which Rob is also going to tackle in a different way. Again, it's easy to think of parasites as always being negative, and that's not the case. Some of them are actually very rare, and so together with Fred, a long-standing friend and colleague of mine, we work on these particular parasites called broom rapes or orobanchi. In the middle, that beautiful purple one is from seed we collected in Japan in 2018. On the right, that's that ivory coloured one. That's a very, very rare species, one of Britain's rarest species actually, called Orobanchi picridis, that we collected seed of from one of its locations. So many of these wild parasitic plants are very rare, they're very beautiful, and they really don't do any harm. Actually, they sort of they take what they need from the host, and they have quite a sustainable population. It tends to be actually when people get involved, and we sort of dare I say, mess about with the ecosystem, and then we perturb the balances, and then you see shifts. So for example, if you were to grow a field of broad beans in part of the world that Rob comes from, actually, so you might well be familiar with these as pests, there's a species of Orobanchi that likes very much to grow on members of the pea family, and so it has leapt onto this monoculture of crops, and it can wipe out a whole crop in the Mediterranean, so parts of south of Spain and Morocco and other areas of the Mediterranean very easily, whereas growing as a natural component of the vegetation, it does no harm at all. And if we move on to the next slide, I'll show you an example of a plant that I work on with Julie at Reading and our student Majid, looking quite menacing, holding a cistanchi. So this is a relative of the examples that I've just shown, but these don't grow in the UK. This parasitic plant or vampire, it grows across the old world deserts. So you find them particularly in the Middle East, across to China through the lowland deserts, extending locally across Mediterranean and Macaronesia. And don't you think that's the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful plants you've seen? I find them truly astonishingly beautiful. As you can see, it's got no leaves or green pigments, and it's living at the expense of another plant. So this is another one of those hollow parasites. Why am I showing this example? Again, linked to this question of friend or foe, and I'll just explain why we're examining this plant. This is a plant that has for millennia, in fact, been used in traditional herbal medicine, particularly in China. And it has all sorts of perceived benefits. Some of them are pharmacologically well characterized, but generally people eat them as a tonic food for health benefits, perceived health benefits, such as trophy attributes, things like health, vigor, stamina, and also sexual vigor seems to be one of the characteristics that it's very much revered for, possibly linked to its form, but I won't dwell on that. So this is a plant that is very much celebrated and prized. And in recent years, farmers in China have started growing this parasitic plant, which is potentially quite difficult, but they've achieved it very well at a huge commercial scale. And this is quite a recent thing. But here's the thing, they are able to grow as a parasite on the host that is tamarisk or saxel. And these are trees which are being planted at the moment at great scale across parts of the world that are threatened by land degradation. So we're all familiar with some of the big global challenges that we face around plastic, around climate change. One of these linked to climate change is land degradation, desertification, the spread of deserts into areas that aren't naturally desertic. And so one of the solutions to this is by planting great long, what are called shelter forests, big bands of trees. So whereas we're busy tree planting here for slightly different reasons, there are other parts of the world where trees are planted in large numbers to halt land degradation. But here's the thing, you can grow Sistanki on those shelter forests as a parasite. So you could grow this as an ancillary crop. And thinking ahead in the future, when we're all looking to what will be the future foods, what are the crops that we need to think about in a changing world? And how do we avoid harvesting wild sources of food unsustainably, as some of these plants have been in the past? And so there may be a solution that we can start to grow parasitic plants like this one alongside other things that we're planting at scale. And perhaps it will be part of a blended solution to some of these problems that we face. And on the next slide, yes, I can see a question on mycoheterotrophs, and it's like you can read my mind, folks, because you're about to see an example of those too. Here are some of the stems that have been dug up. They're not roots, they're stems. And look at the size of them. You can see the people for scale, and they fetch a very high price. They're very, very much valued and celebrated, particularly in China and some other parts of the world as well. But I thought I'd share that wonderful picture. And on the next slide, I think, yeah, here they are. So someone asked a question about plants that are parasitic on fungi. So just to answer Leslie's question about what are they used for, the Sistanki. So it's eaten, generally it's dried and chopped up and eaten as a health tonic or a tonic food. So something that is believed to give general health benefits such as stamina and things like that. The plants that you see on this slide, these are called mycoheterotrophs. So they're still vampires, if you will, but these ones do not steal their food from other plants. They steal them from fungi. And if you're any doubt that these plants are astonishing, weird and extraordinary, I wanted to show you these plants, which I work on with my colleagues in Malaysia, that you can see on the screen here. City, who works in forestry, and Dome, who's one of the most extraordinary guys you could ever meet, who works with local communities in the rainforest and discovers plants. You know, we talk about discovery, and there's been a long legacy of us thinking of Western discovery, and actually many of these plants, of course, were known about for a long time, but many are still being discovered today. And for me, it's been a truly fulfilling thing to work with these guys on the flora that they know so well locally. And we described a new species actually together, which is that orange lantern-like one. It's called a fairy lantern that's cut out at the front, and we described that this year. And on the next slide, Rob, you can see just how excited people get by these species discoveries, particularly when they're very odd plants as well. They seem to really capture people's imaginations. And actually, coming back to the thing that I started in this talk, I said that I'm really excited by the idea of finding new ways to engage and excite people by plants, and to challenge the notion that plants are dull or inanimate. And these are plants, some of the plants that we're talking about tonight, that really have the power to stop people in their tracks, to examine plants in a different way, and hopefully to excite people. And I'm really interested and keen in exciting younger generations and cohorts of future scientists to be just as excited by plants as they are by animals, which honestly we know they're not today. And so we have to work harder to do that. Now, in the interest of time, I need to move on to some mistletoes. So on the next slide, these are relatives, believe it or not, of mistletoes. So the mistletoes belong to a group or an order of plants called the Santallales or Santallales, and it's a very mixed bag of things that DNA has shown us all belong together. And so here are some examples. This extraordinary one on the left that looks like a deep sea creature is called Langsdorffia, and this is one that my colleague took a photo of in Brazil, and the other one is Balanophora. So these are holoparasitic. You'll remember that that's the example that I mentioned. They steal all of their food with no green pigments. And then on the next slide, I've put some examples of some hemiparasitic mistletoe relatives. So there's a Thesium, a bastard toeflax as it's called, and then Osiris on the right. These are root hemiparasites. So they steal food from the roots of other plants, but they still photosynthesize. So they're sort of playing with the boundaries of robbery, I guess you could say. And then on the next slide, I've got some mistletoes proper. Now, again, when we think of mistletoes, we tend to think of one type, which is the one on the right that everyone's, or most people are familiar with. There are actually many different types of mistletoe as well. And they even belong to two different families. So you've got what are called the showy mistletoes. That's a photograph that I took of plants we found growing in Israel and Palestine in 2019, I believe it was, and this one is growing on an acacia. It's called a Plecosepalis. So that's how mistletoes look in other parts of the world. And then we've got the familiar mistletoe Viscum album, which Rob's going to show us some fancy videos of him looking at them in Oxford. And I think on the next slide is probably the last one that I'm going to talk to. And this, before Rob takes over, is an example of a tree that has been truly engulfed by the European mistletoe, the one with which we're familiar, Viscum album. This is a lime tree growing just outside the entrance to Oxford Botanic Garden, and you can see the extent to which it's been infested. Preempting one of the questions I expect we'll get, because I normally do when we talk about mistletoes, we're often asked, what trees can they grow on? And the reality is they can grow on many different types of tree, as we know. We don't fully understand the mechanisms as to why they grow on some and not others, and that's something Rob and I are really excited about finding out. But we do know that they show preferences. So there are some trees, as I'm sure our listeners will know, that they really like to infest, like apple trees, for example, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes with detrimental impact. And just before I hand over to Rob, I just wanted to show, because I actually have one in front of me here, and I don't know if it's going to let me, but I wanted to show the properties of the berry, which is completely slimy. Oh my goodness, you probably can't see that very well. It's not working as well as I hoped, but it is completely and rather grotesquely.
Well, Chris,
okay, good. Okay, good. It's kind of disgusting, and I don't have anything to wipe it off actually, but it's just going to put it on my desk for now. But this contains a substance called viscin. It's like glue, and believe me, I can't get it off. Okay, good. Thanks, guys. You can see it well. And this is part of the mechanism that the mistletoe uses, by which its seeds can adhere to the branches via a courier, which I think I'll leave to Rob to explain, that enables them to stick so well to the branches that they then later parasitize. And I think with that, I'm gonna hand over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much. Can I confirm if you can hear me? Fantastic.
Loud
Thank you
and
so
clear.
much. Fabulous. So I'm actually going to take a really short walk over from across the other side of the street. So the photograph that Chris is showing here is one of a really heavily infested host tree situated on one side of the street, which happens to be the site of the Oxford Botanical Garden. But a lot of the footage and the research that I'm going to show you in collaboration with Chris takes place across the street in Magdalen College, one of the 38 different colleges of the University of Oxford where we are conducting this research. So let me tell you how I came to work with mistletoes for a second. I am a population ecologist. I'm really interested in using demographic data, that's rates of survival, growth, and reproduction, for as many species as I possibly can get my hands on in order to build ecological forecasts. If I know how individuals in a given population survive, grow, and reproduce, I can make forecasts about which species are going to persevere and which species are going to go locally or globally extinct. And during the last 15 years, I've been building a database of open access demographic data across the tree of life. These databases are called Compadre and Comadre. And through the tight work of this open access enterprise, I've realized that we have a gap of knowledge, particularly when it comes to our understanding of the demography and the population biology of plants. And that is that we don't really know a lot about parasitic plants in terms of their rates of survival, growth, and reproduction. And there may be some historical and some legacy reasons for that, but I would argue that one of the main reasons that explains that gap of knowledge is that getting to know them can be sometimes logistically a headache. So for instance, I'll have you know, I'm now officially trained as a tree climber by 2 different universities and the respective safety protocols through the University of Oxford here, and also through the University of Queensland, down under, where I was also doing mistletoe research on a completely different mistletoe species. So what you can see here is me with a massive slingshot throwing a line. That's me hanging from a host tree. This is in Ascot here in the UK, and me trying to get as close as possible to different individuals of mistletoes. But of course, even with this approach, which is a lot of fun, but it's really energetically consuming and it's very time consuming as well. It's not very efficient. Even with this approach, there are some logistical limitations to how close one can get to each individual mistletoe. For instance, I couldn't possibly anchor my rope above a really thin twig because then my stability would be compromised. So this approach, really fun, although human resources would not deem it as such, it's actually quite risky, but it has then triggered other approaches that we have had to entertain in my lab. We've taken an approach following the realization of how difficult really it is to climb up on trees to quantify the dynamics of mistletoes, to go down to the ground. So we spent a lot of time, it's coming up now to 10 years in Ascot in Selwood Park, collecting demographic information from ground level using scopes and binos. The information there, it's relatively faster to collect. What you can see here, I'll zoom that in. What I'm highlighting there is different individuals of mistletoe that are adults with a profile in fluorescent green, and other individuals in yellow that are meant to be seedlings. Now, of course, if you know anything about the biology of any plant, is that seedlings are usually very tiny. And you can see there's some circles, particularly on the bottom left, that have got a relatively large size. So these are individuals that I saw for the first time, but probably they had been there for a long time before I first identified them. So even from ground level, there's a lot to be improved in terms of our error measurements and our estimations of when mistletoes are born, how will they survive, how will they grow, and how much they reproduce. So their life cycle, in other words. So this has taken my team, my research team, the Salguero team at the Department of Biology Oxford, and myself through the needs to train ourselves as UAV unmanned aerial vehicle, aka drone pilots. And this is really revolutionizing the type of research that Chris and myself and the rest of my research team can now conduct. Through the marriage between biological research and technologies, we can now get a much better estimate of how big different individuals are they reproducing, yes or no, and more importantly, can we actually see the seedlings? What I'm gonna show now here is in the front, you can see 2, I think it's lime trees. Lime trees, as you perhaps know, are deciduous. If I hadn't told you that, you would think that these trees, the footage, by the way, was collected in December last year, when the trees will be deciduous. If I hadn't told you that, perhaps a naive eye would have thought, oh, well, that's just the leaves. But no, that's just how heavily infested these 2 host trees are. Moreover, the host tree that is now being revealed over here on the left-hand side is one that a heavy infestation of mistletoes kill. You can see that none of the leaves of the mistletoe are green. And this poses one of the most important evolutionary conundrums of the parasite and host dynamic system. I'll tell you what that is in a second, but I'm going to take a linguistic break and let you enjoy the prairie of Moglen Meadows with Oxford in the background and a drone pilot, that is me, at the bottom right, collecting the footage. Isn't that just absolutely gorgeous? That tower that you can see at the far right is the same tower that Chris showed from the other side of the Botanical Garden of Oxford. Now, the visible range, which is what we humans see, can sometimes be a tricky range from which to see life. So what my research group has been doing since is update the priors. We've been updating the technology, and what we now do is we use multidimensional drone footage, which allows us to detect how likely each pixel in this footage is to be able to conduct photosynthesis or not. Pixels in gray show low probability of photosynthesis being carried out. Pixels in green, yellow, orange, and red show a high probability of photosynthesis being carried out. So specifically, the image bound that we're picturing here, that we're targeting here, has to do with identifying plants. And this is really helping us identify those tiny seedlings that from ground level, using scopes, we simply weren't able to identify until they were large enough. Now, I mentioned before that the mistletoe and host system really constitutes a fundamental conundrum in evolutionary biology. You see, unlike many other parasites that go happily from one stage to another stage, perusing or harvesting and damaging different species, like the life cycle on your right-hand side, mistletoes are obligate and sessile parasites. What I mean by that is that once the berries are dispersed, usually by birds, mistle thrush, as you will see in a second, and they land on a twig of a potential good candidate host, they will germinate and they will always forever for the rest of their lives be stuck onto that branch. They cannot take their hostoria, as if it were, and say, I don't like it here, I'm gonna move over to the next host because I'm done with this host now. So there's a really important question here that is, of course, it is in the interest of the individual mistletoe to extract as many resources, that sap that Chris was referring to when he was calling these creatures vampires. But it's in the interest of the mistletoe not to extract too much, because in so doing, it can kill the host. And when the host is done, so is the parasite. So one of the main questions that Chris and myself and my research group are trying to explore is what are the regulatory mechanisms by which the host keeps the parasite in check and by which the whole parasite load, the parasitic community in a host, controls itself. One thing that I like to make a point for is that mistletoes, even though called parasites, do bring a lot of really positive values, both to ecosystems and also to us humans. And so I know that through popular culture, certain movies that were parasites has been perpetuated into meaning something absolutely negative. But I would like to make the point that while parasitic plants do have the really important ecological and folklore role in societies. For instance, think about it. When do mistletoes produce their berries? Mistletoes produce their berries when there's not many other plants producing berries, and therefore they can give rise to a really useful resource for other species to munch on, namely birds. There's also studies that have shown that in trees that have got mistletoes, the diversity of moth increases by tenfold. Likewise, research done in another mistletoe species in Australia has shown that the surroundings, the soil that surrounds the tree host that has mistletoes tends to have a higher nutrient concentration for nitrogen, therefore allowing other grassland species to coexist. And that has to do with the fact that the nitrogen that the mistletoe is producing and fixing will then be shed within the leaves, and that nitrogen then takes part of the local soil around the host tree. Now I want to spend a little bit of time. I'm not an expert in history. I'm not an expert in folklore, but I do find this topic really interesting, and I hope that the participants here will follow that as well. So mistletoes have got a really important societal role, and they have had it for centuries now. For instance, Druids consider mistletoes to be sacred above all else. This is so because this was particularly so when the mistletoe grew on oaks. On the 6th night of the new moon after the midwinter festival, the chief Druids would go in procession with the rest of the Druid in the fellowship to the older oak tree, climb onto the oak tree, and with a golden saw, cut the biggest mistletoe. That mistletoe would then be collected by a white sheet, sign of purity. Now, it was very important when that mistletoe was being collected for the mistletoe to never touch the ground. It was understood, it was assumed that the source of its magic was that it had never touched the ground. If you think about it, a mistletoe is never born in the ground. And so you can see on this picture a group of Druids that are anxiously awaiting for the bigger mistletoe to fall onto that sheet. From the harvest, then the Druids will go on to create healing elixirs that will be then used for cures of infertility, cramps, and headaches. And sometimes those mistletoes will be hung from the main window or from the door of the house in order to protect the family from evil. Notably, mistletoe is currently being used for cancer research. So it's not just very historical in folklore. Mistletoe has got very important value for human societies. Now, I'd like to make a point to the audience though. Mistletoe is toxic. And next time that you have an encounter with it, you should appreciate it, but I definitely don't encourage that you ingest neither the leaves nor the berries. You may be wondering, where does the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe come? Well, let me take you back to Scandinavian mythology. So Loki, some of you might have seen the Marvel movies and may perhaps have seen the eternal battle between the Helmsworth, Thor, and Loki. So according to Scandinavian mythology, Loki wanted to kill Thor. In order to do so, of course, he was quite cheeky and he would never attempt to kill Thor himself. What he did, however, is he created a spear out of a stem of mistletoe, knowing that the wood of mistletoe can also be toxic. He then passed on that spear to one of his brothers. This brother happened to be blind, and he encouraged him to play around with the spear, knowing that Thor would be around. Accidentally, he scratched one of the arms of Thor. And because of the toxicity of that mistletoe spear, Thor died. Now, Thor's mother learned about this, and with all her magic and power, brought him back from death. So she resurrected Thor. And at that point, she was quite concerned that as lovely as mistletoes are, the local society would consider mistletoes to be harmful and something to never interact with. That's why she decided to create the tradition to hang mistletoes on top of the ceiling of every house, because she wanted mistletoe not to pay the price for some of the sins that Loki had committed, but for mistletoe to forever be a sign of peace and love. That's the origin for why now it is a tradition to kiss under the mistletoe. Now, going back to some of these potential positive or negative effects that mistletoes can create on their host, in my research group, there's some really interesting research going on led by a master's student by the name of Irene and a PhD student who's helping co-supervise by the name of Connor. What they're doing is they're going around all 38 colleges around the city of Oxford, and they are identifying host trees that have got low mistletoe loads, like the one on the left-hand side. Hopefully you can see a yellow circle that points out to the only mistletoe on that tree, and other trees of the same species that have got a massive parasitic loads. The one on the right-hand side, I think, speaks by itself. Again, if I didn't tell you that this is a deciduous tree species, you'd think that it is actually containing its own leaves, but it's just a really heavy mistletoe parasitic loads. And what they're now doing is they're comparing the growth rings of the host trees in the last years to see if the host trees that have been heavily infested have got a lower rate of growth. which will be indicative of a negative effect of this parasite onto its host. We don't just yet have the answer. We're hoping to have it in 2 weeks. So if you want to know more about it, please stay tuned. Another key question in mistletoe research, which Chris alluded to, is we don't really understand what mechanisms allow for the mistletoe to distribute itself, to disperse into different tree species. I think that somebody before was asking the question, why apples? We don't effectively, the answer is we don't know. Why hawthorns? We also know that they can grow in hawthorns. They're in the same taxonomic group. We also know that they can grow on poplars, on quercus, even in pine trees, by the way. But we don't really know why that is the case. So one of the things that Chris and I are doing down at the Arboretum, this is conveniently located about 20 minutes by car down from my house, is back in March, we identify quite a few host trees of 3 different species. We then put on some of these berries that Chris showed you before. Incidentally, the Latin name of the European white berry mistletoe is Viscum album. Viscum means gluey, viscous, sticky. Album, which also gave rise to the word albino, means white. So it's the white sticky. So the white sticky berries, we put onto different branches, and every month we've been going back to see at what stage are the embryos failing or managing to penetrate into the woods of the host tree. What you can see on the right-hand side is a tiny embryo of a still living individual that was photographed just short of 2 months ago. So they've spent all the summer trying to penetrate, and some of them are still alive. But another really interesting agent that we've not talked about is the dispersal. So we know that when a mistletoe lands onto the tree, it typically lands on top of the tree, and that through gravitation, once the mistletoe becomes reproductive, the berries will fall down. But we also know that mistletoes can disperse horizontally, not just vertically, and they do so mainly through birds. Here you've got a beautiful and perfectly timely photograph of mistle thrush, one of the local birds that does a really good job at not only eating, but also distributing the berries of mistletoes. This is a line of research that we've been working on for quite a few years, and we're now ready to engage with a much broader society. So if you would like to partake in some of the research that you've just heard about today, we will be delighted to have you. Doesn't matter, you don't need to be based in Oxford. In fact, there's something to be said about really exploring the full scale of mistletoe distribution in biology across the UK and potentially in other countries. If you're interested, please take out your smartphone technology and very quickly scan that QR code that will take you to the appropriate website. I'll leave it there open for a few more seconds before I move on. How long do mistletoes live? We've got estimates now. We've got a long-term study in Peril in Ascot that tells us that some mistletoes can live up to 9 years. So there's a few individuals of mistletoes that we've been following since they were born, and they're still alive. Okay, so on that note, I'd like to first of all thank Sara and also Chris. It's always pleasure to be able to work with you on these matters, but also Chris and I and Sara would like to take the opportunity to advertise a PhD opportunity. Again, take out your smartphone technology if you want, scan that QR code, or simply type in tinyurl.com/PhD mistletoe. There's a PhD opportunity to come join our respective labs at the Botanical Garden and the Department of Biology to work really closely with the Tree Council and Uni Oxford to examine some of these really interesting questions. Sara, thank you so much for having us today.
Oh, that's absolutely amazing. Thank you. And just going back to the previous slide, we do hope that there will be a citizen science research project that volunteers will be able to come and help with. It's likely to be in the sort of mid-end of next year, and it's slightly dependent upon funding, but it would be really exciting. So we'll send an email around later with all these links and so on, so that if you do want to be kept updated and perhaps take part in the future project, we're talking to various other partners like the Orchard Project and some other mistletoe experts. So more news on that one soon. Are there any questions that are still that we would like to answer? There was
If
one
that's
about-
okay, if that's okay with you, Sarah, I forgot to mention this, right? So while you read some of the questions, I like to give the audience, I forgot to use this prop, a sense of the gravity of the physical damage that a mistletoe can incur on one of the hosts. Just really briefly, Chris showed you a photo of a cross section of a host tree at the vineyard, I think it was, right, Chris? And a mistletoe in it. This is a massive branch of a poplar that fell last year in one of the colleges in Oxford. Of course, us being besties with the head gardeners immediately called us and gave us the tissue. So what you can see here is different cross sections. I'm gonna see if I can move the lights so you can see better. This cross section here, can you see that more or less?
Just about, Rob.
Okay, let me see if I can move the, okay, is that better? That's perhaps a bit
It's
too...
quite bright. There you
Yeah,
go.
is that...
There you go.
Okay. So this wide wood, this section and only that section corresponds to the poplar. And all of this is wood. All of this is mistletoe. So when you think about mistletoe as being a herbaceous plant, it ain't. It's woody as they come. And not only that, if you keep on digging down into the cross sections, you can find this haustoria. Can you see that invagination? These lines are lines of the haustoria of the mistletoe penetrating, going downwards into the vasculature of the tree. How
These
fascinating
are
is
Rob's favourite drinks coasters on his office desk.
that? They're quite massive, aren't they?
There's some lovely comments to say thank you to both of you. You've really made a very complex subject incredibly accessible with lots of lovely photos and images, but also just you know, similes and so on as you've gone through things. Thank you both so much. I mean, sadly, we are coming to the end of the evening's conversation, but I just wanted to say as well, if you know, if anybody's looking for Christmas present ideas, do take a look on Chris's website. Again, we'll send links around later, but you can find fabulous books there, such as The Perfectly Peculiar Plants, or even The Botany of Gin. Fantastic, great gifts to go in a stocking or under the tree. Lots of links coming up on that. I wanted to thank Team Tree Council as well for all their help behind the scenes, for Dom, to Claire, who's been with us, and thank you to our audience for being with us, but the hugest thanks and so on to Rob and Chris for teaching us so much and for making it so accessible and easy to understand.
Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I just wanted to say thank you as well for all the lovely comments that you've all shared. I tried to answer some of the questions, sorry for being brief, but I got through as many as possible. And I wanted to say thank you, to echo all of those thanks, and to say that one of the wonderful things about giving talks like this is that I consider you, Sarah and Rob, as both friends as well as colleagues, and it's an absolute pleasure. So thanks ever so much.
Oh, thank
Indeed.
you, everybody. Have a great weekend and have a really good festive season. It feels like that now. Goodbye all.